Chaitanya Prabhu. Srila Prabhupada ki, Grantaraj Sri Caitanya Caritamrita ki, Samaveta Bhakta-vrinda ki, Gaur Premanande. Jaya Jaya Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda. Jaya Dvaita Chanda Jai Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Jaya Jaya Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda. Jaya Dvaita Chanda Jai Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Jaya Jaya Sri Chaitanya Jaya Nityananda. Jaya Dvaita Chandra Jai Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Sri Caitanya Caritamrita, Adi-lila, chapter 7, text 166.
68 on the board.
58?
68.
68. So I'll read, there's a couple of bridging verses. 68's the one with the purport, so that makes sense. Apane dakshina desha kolila gaman, grame grame koila Krishna nama pracharan. Sri Caitanya Mahaprabhu personally went to South India, and he broadcast the holy name of Lord Krishna in every town and village. Setu banda paryanta koila bhaktir prachar, Krishna prema diya koila sabara nisthar. Thus the Lord went to the southernmost tip of the Indian peninsula, known as Setubanda, Cape Comorin. Everywhere he distributed the bhakti cult and love of Krishna, and in this way he delivered everyone. Eita kohila pancha tatvara vyakyan, ihara sravane hoya chaitanya tattvagan. Eita kohila pancha tatvera vyakyan, ihara sravane hoya chaitanya tattvagyan. Eita kohila pancha tatvera vyakyan, ihar sravane hoya chaitanya tattvagyan. Eita, this, kohila, described, panchatatvera, of the panchatattva, vyakyan, explanation, ihar, of this, sravane, hearing, hoya, becomes, chaitanya tattva, the truth of Sri Caitanya Mahaprabhu, gyan, knowledge. Translation: I thus explain the truth of the Panchatattva. One who hears this explanation increases in knowledge of Sri Caitanya Mahaprabhu. Please repeat. I thus explain the truth of the Panchatattva. One who hears this explanation increases in knowledge of Sri Caitanya Mahaprabhu. Purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. The Panchatattva is a very important factor in understanding Sri Caitanya Mahaprabhu. There are sahajiyas who, not knowing the importance of the Panchatattva, concoct their own slogans such as Bhajai Nitai Gaur Radhe Sham, Japa Hare Krishna Hare Ram, or Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda, Hare Krishna Hare Rama, Sri Radhe Govinda. Such chants may be very good poetry, but they cannot help us to go forward in devotional service. In such chants there are also many discrepancies which need not be discussed here. Strictly speaking, when chanting the names of the Panchatattva, one should fully offer his obeisances. Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda, Sri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaur Bhaktavinda. By such chanting, one is blessed with the competency to chant the Hare Krishna Mahamantra without offense. When chanting the Hare Krishna Mahamantra, one should also chant it fully. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. One should not foolishly adopt any of the slogans concocted by imaginative devotees. If one actually wants to derive the effects of chanting, one must strictly follow the great acharyas. This is confirmed in the Mahabharata. Mahajano yena gata supanta. The real path of progress is that which is traversed by great acharyas and authorities. Srila Prabhupada ki. Oma Jnana Timirandasya Jnananjana Salakaya Chakshurun Militanjena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. I was born in the darkest ignorance, but my spiritual master has kindly forced open my eyes with the scalpel of knowledge. I therefore offer my respectful obeisances unto him. Such a sweet purport. Srila Prabhupada introduces to the Panchatattva. It's described when Lord Chaitanya's appearance is predicted. How was that verse? 11.5.32. Krishnavadam Tusha Krishnam Sangupangastrapashadam Jagga Sankitana Praya Yajantihi Sumedasa. That when Krishna comes, he'll have a different complexion. Krishnavanam Tusha Krishnam. Krishnavana means the syllables of Krishna are always on his lips. But Tvisha Krishna, his complexion is not blackish, rather it's golden. Because Krishna wanted to taste the love that Srimati Radharani has, her hue actually covered his body. So he wasn't his usual blackish sham, but he had the complexion of molten gold tinged with kumkum. This is the complexion of Srimati Radharani. You could say it's the color of love for Krishna. Sangopangastrapashadam, and he came accompanied by his weapons. Who are those weapons? Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasari Gaur Bhaktavinda. So all of those parts and parcels, the former devotee, the incarnation of a devotee, the energy of a devotee, and the devotee of a devotee, these make up the Panchatattva. Panchatattva Vakam Krishnam Bhakta Rupa Sarupakam Bhaktavataram Bhaktakyam Namami Bhakti Shaktikam. So we have to remember that our only qualification for accessing Krishna consciousness comes through Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, comes through the Panchatattva. Therefore Srila Prabhupada introduced that prior to chanting Hare Krishna, we chant the Panchatattva Mahamantra, so that we have, as Srila Prabhupada says here, the competency to be free from offense. The reality is we're super unqualified, like ridiculously unqualified, unworthy. Our qualification is purely that we are patita, and that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is patita pavan. The fact that he is the savior of the most fallen, and we happen to be the most fallen, that makes it our qualification. Just like we were singing now, patita pavana hetu tava avatar moshamo patita prabhu napai payar. The cause, hetu, of your appearance, your descension, your coming down from Goloka, is to give your mercy to the fallen souls. Well, says Narottam Das Thakur, you won't find anyone more fallen than me, therefore my claim is first. And in the first line of the same song, Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Doya Koramori, please give me your mercy. Toma bina ke doyalu jagata samsari. Other than you, who else could be more merciful in this world? If you're not merciful to me, who will give me the mercy? Ha Prabhu Nityananda Premananda Sukhi. Lord Nityananda, you're very happy. Please be merciful to me. I'll also become happy. So this is how Srila Narottam Das Thakur invites us to also offer our prayers to the Panchatattva. Interestingly, Srila Prabhupada very quickly brings up the subject of the Sahajiyas. The Sahajiyas are a frequent theme in Srila Prabhupada's books. I used to wonder, who are these Sahajas that Srila Prabhupada is focusing so much attention? Do we really need to know all of these deviant people? But actually Srila Prabhupada is trying to awaken us, to make us vigilant, that we can also start to concoct. Srila Prabhupada was always very wary of concoctions coming into the society of devotees. Srila Prabhupada would define Sahajiyas as those who take Krishna consciousness very cheaply. Without following Vaidic Bhakti, they immediately think they've become intimate associates of Krishna, that the rules no longer apply to them, and that they're now seeing Krishna in a bush in Vrindavan. Srila Prabhupada would sometimes joke like that. Of course, it's partly joking, but it's partly disgust. The Sahajiyas would often imitate things like Adi-lila, where presumably they take the active parts, and it descends into some muchi activity rather than it being the highest rasa, parakya ras. Another tendency of Sahajas is to imitate the ecstatic symptoms, which are the true ornaments of great advanced souls. They might roll around in the dust of Vrindavan. I gather there were times where Srila Prabhupada, if someone exhibited such symptoms, he invited devotees to potentially kick them just to see if they were truly transcendental to their external surrounds. So he wasn't impressed with these things. In fact, it could be argued that Srila Prabhupada was more irate with philosophical deviations even than some kind of petty weakness, sensual problems. One other aspect of the Sahajas is this tendency to invent, to come up with something that wasn't introduced by the previous acharyas. If you think about it, it's quite an arrogant thing. I didn't pick this up from anywhere. I'm not humbly representing what I've received in disciplic succession. I'm creating. Srila Prabhupada calls it here being imaginative, that we are concocting with our imagination. And Srila Prabhupada even gives one of the bogus mantras which has been concocted. Actually, we hear this mantra sometimes near the Vrindavan Temple. There's some ashram there where they have the loudspeakers and the Nitai Gaur Radhe Shyam Hare Krishna Hare Ram, mixing up the personalities. It's very strange. And there's another one here. Haven't heard this one so much. Anyway, Srila Prabhupada says that we don't need to go into detail about how these things are bogus. But the thing is, we should humbly follow what he's introduced. Let me just remind myself of my notes here. Faithful representation, faithfully passing on, obliges us to not take Krishna consciousness cheaply, but actually to study carefully, to hear carefully. That's why we hear that Shravanam is the first and foremost of the processes of devotional service, because we humbly submit to Shastra, to the Guru, to the sadhus, and bathe our consciousness in that understanding, absorb ourselves in the proper understanding. In that way, when it comes time for us to share, we're not inventing, we're not fabricating something new. How can we feel that we can loyally pass on what Srila Prabhupada has given us if we haven't actually carefully picked it up, carefully studied? So maybe we develop a casual understanding with all kinds of misconceptions. I think this is quite a common thing nowadays. In fact, one worries, although Srila Prabhupada sacrificed so much to give us so much literature, not so many are taking full advantage of that literature. Not so many are studying it threadbare to ensure that they can faithfully pass on what Srila Prabhupada gave, which is a shame. This is one Srila Prabhupada's loving gift. Imagine that we go out, expend so much time and trouble picking out a gift for somebody. Maybe it cost a pretty packet as well, and we bought it as a manifestation of love, and then the person just leaves it to one side. How hurtful actually that would be. So we owe it to Srila Prabhupada to take full advantage, that which he has labored, sacrificing his sleep, pushing himself even at an advanced age to translate and comment on all of these literatures. We owe it to Srila Prabhupada. Otherwise the danger is we will invent, we will concoct, we'll lazily try to explain things in a way that makes sense to us, but not in a way that's faithfully following the Mahajans, as Srila Prabhupada described. And there's lots of ways in which we can see this. We may have misconceptions, we may pass on misconceptions, we may find that our fragile faith is troubled by events that we lack the Shastra Chakshus, lack the eyes of Scripture to make sense of. We might find ourselves engaged still in mundane things and retaining an appetite for mundane things because our intelligence hasn't been properly fortified to distinguish truth from illusion. We regularly see that devotees get troubled unnecessarily by the fluctuations of material nature. We may have met devotees who spend an inordinate amount of time complaining as if they haven't even understood the principle of karma, or that this world was never set up for our enjoyment, that whatever it is that we're getting is our due penance. And actually it's a symbol of Krishna's mercy. Probably we're just getting a token of what we really deserve. And we should tolerate, suffer gracefully. Another sign of someone who's not immersed themselves enough is casual apparat, not being careful about how they think about and talk about devotees. This would be another classic sign that one's distinctions, one's thought process has not been properly shaped by the philosophy, by the teachings of Srila Prabhupada and the great acharyas. So it's described that when we study Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, Caitanya Caritamrita, when we hear from devotees, it's like worshipping Krishna with our intelligence. The word intelligence is thrown around very loosely nowadays. Sometimes it's used interchangeably with the word mind, but Krishna actually describes in the Bhagavad Gita that the intelligence is meant to be the supervisor of the mind. The mind is more of an impulsive thing. Thoughts are projected there. Often we don't even know the source of thoughts. They're just things that drift into our consciousness. If we learn how to discipline our minds with our intelligence, then we won't entertain problematic thoughts. We'll notice them, we'll allow them to drift out. Apuyamanam achala pratishtam samudramapa pravishanti advat tadvat kamayam pravishanti save sashantim apnoti nakamakami. Right at the end of the second chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, a person whose mind is not disturbed, like rivers flow into the ocean, yet the ocean remains still, they'll achieve happiness, and not the person who's always agitated by their thought process. So our intellects are meant to be able to evaluate. This is one of the functions of intelligence, evaluation. Is this a thought that I should entertain, dwell on, retain, or is this the thought that I should try and switch my attention to something different? One who's fortified their intelligence with Shastra Chakshus, with the eyes of Scripture, develops that strength, that discipline to distinguish the truth from the illusion. There's other ways which we learn various distinctions by absorbing our intelligence in Krishna's words. If we've fortified our intelligence by Shastra Chakshus, by the eyes of Scripture, then we'll be able to spot deviations very early, either in our own thought process or possibly in some teaching that someone's introduced that's not bona fide, and we'll root it out very quickly. But if our intelligence is slack and unexercised, we might casually take on board all kinds of misconceptions without challenging them. And this is a problem. The mind is also prompt to feeling. So thinking, entertaining thoughts, feeling. So sometimes we will use in Western philosophy the idea of the heart as the feeling instrument. Heart and mind are used somewhat interchangeably in the Vedic traditions, but feelings are taking place in the mind. So we have an impulse, an instinct to do something, a drive to do something, or we might have an attitudinal setting. Like, for instance, the alarm goes off in the morning, and then we have a direct experience of whether we feel inclined to wake up. Our intelligence may say, it's time to go to Mangalati, it's time to banish sleep, it's time to come out of the ignorance and move into chanting and sattva and so on. But our inclination, our impulse, our feelings, our attitudes may be to hit the snooze button. So the intelligence is what scrutinizes these impulses, these attitudes. I've started to develop a bit of an attitude to so-and-so prabhu. I wonder how I acquired that attitude towards so-and-so prabhu. And is it actually a favorable attitude to entertain? Anukulyasa sankalpa, pratikulyasya vajanam. We should only accept the things that are favorable for our Krishna consciousness. It's not favorable for me to cop an attitude towards so-and-so prabhu. But if our intelligence has not been nicely developed, then we'll just be running around on the chariot of the mind. Manoratanasati dhavatopahi. Our convictions will be subject to whatever our wavering, flickering mind is doing on a daily basis. So this idea of inventing is generally the restlessness of the mind. I feel like, I'm bored of the usual every day. This should already be a clue. If we're starting to get a little... if Krishna consciousness is feeling hackneyed in some ways, Lord Chaitanya actually tells us that's the indication that offenses have crept in. Because Krishna consciousness should always be joyful. In this verse, Nam Namakari Bahudhani to Sarva Shaktis, there's an expanded translation in the last chapter of Caitanya Caritamrita, where Lord Chaitanya says a little bit more than the one that we normally say. He says, because I commit offenses while chanting, therefore I have no taste. So if we're restless, then we may be attracted by anything that's novel. Oh, so-and-so Prabhu is telling me a story that I haven't heard before. And this is where we need to discern in our minds. Do they have a shastric source for that story? Or has it just been something that has now become passed on colloquially? It was invented by somebody. So-and-so is going to give me Siddha Pranali. Oh, that feels so much more exciting and novel than just chanting Hare Krishna. I think I'll go down that path. It must be bona fide because the person has a beard. So they're Indian and aged. So I'm into something that other people don't have. Therefore, how profound is my insight? How special have I become? So puja and pratishtha are a couple of the weeds that grow in the heart, particularly if we're chanting inattentively. It's described that inattentive or offensive chanting also waters the weeds, not just the devotional creeper, the bhakti lata. but weeds, nisidacha, activities that are unfavorable for achieving perfection, the path of perfection. Srila Prabhupada would translate the four regs, breaking the four regs. Kutinati, being duplicitous. Jiva himsa, being violent towards other living beings. And that doesn't necessarily just stop at things like, meat eating or being aggressive, getting into fights, but even just having harmful attitudes, or even neglecting to preach is sometimes considered to be jiva himsa, to withhold truth from those who might benefit from it. And then labha, puja, pratishta, these are other weeds. So if I'm feeling the need to feel special, I have a special mantra. I am in possession of privileged knowledge that you won't find it everywhere else. This should already, to the awakened intelligence, be a warning sign. Like if Prabhupada didn't set us out on that path, better safe than sorry. At least we should always go to Guru, Shastra and Sadhu. So if someone introduces something, our powers of discernment, our intelligence should say, do you mind telling me, Prabhu, where you got that from? I just want to be careful that I'm not picking up something that doesn't have a bona fide source. And Srila Prabhupada also taught us that whenever we're teaching, we should be ready to back up with the relevant pramanas, with the relevant evidences. So I might stop here. I hope it was a little bit provocative. I won't speak for long today, but see if there are any questions or comments. Srila Prabhupada ki.
Just wondering, in relation to this verse, Sri Krishna Goswami says now, speaking about Panchatattva. This was discussed a few months ago, but I forgot what was said. How do we relate to this whole long, extended pastime of Mahaprabhu and Mahabharata? And us is in relation to the Panchatattva. Is this pastime just finished being related? And now Krishna Goswami now explain Panchatattva.
This whole chapter is about the Panchatattva, the truth of Panchatattva. I wish I had personally greater authority in this topic. We know that Lord Chaitanya comes with his associates, so those associates are also ways of us being able to access Lord Chaitanya's mercy, just like we've been celebrating recently. It was Lord Sri Adwaita who invited Lord Chaitanya to come. Lord Nityananda is also especially merciful on the fallen souls. We hear the pastime, for instance, of when he and Haridas Thakur went out and were assaulted by Jagai and Madhai. Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, although the most merciful, was invoking his Sudarshan Chakra. But somehow, Lord Nityananda was even prepared to forgive that offense. So, we look to Lord Chaitanya surrounded, just like Krishna is most pleased when we evoke his name relating to a devotee, like Nanda Nandan or Jashoda Nandan or Gopi Jana Vallabha. These names are especially pleasing. I think it's described in teachings of Lord Chaitanya, primary names and secondary names. Names like Vishnu or even Narayan, which emphasize his position as God, are not quite as pleasing as those where he's invoked along with his devotees, with his personal attributes are mentioned. So in the same way, by remembering Lord Chaitanya along with his complete entourage, we're even more pleasing to him. Aradhananam sarvesham Vishnu aradhanam param tasmat parataram devi tadyanam samachanam. Krishna is especially pleased if we remember tadya, those who are dear. So in the same way that Narottam Das Thakur tells us in this song, dear husband of Sita, Adwaita Gosai, please be merciful to me. If you're merciful, then Gaura Nitai must certainly be merciful to me. So it's like that. We go through the agency of the entire Panchatattva. That's as much as I can speak, but I'll welcome others who may also wish to elaborate on the significance of Panchatattva. Yeah.
Question. Prabhupada speaks about sahajas and their mantras in ISKCON. In ISKCON nowadays, we are some who may or may not do their Haribol mantras. So how do we deal with those who do strange, unbona fide ways of performing kirtan, thus giving the society a strange perception for the general public, such as dressing in weird ways and acting somewhat eccentric? Correction, not we are, but they are.
Yeah, I think so. We have to remember the standards that Srila Prabhupada set. There are times where Srila Prabhupada would literally just stop the kirtan if he felt that the mood was off, or if devotees were introducing extra words. I often wonder how he'd think about the narration, from the heart and these kind of things, because he never introduced those. And so I wonder, how would Srila Prabhupada feel? Because why is it just not enough to do things exactly as Srila Prabhupada introduced? That's why I feel like it's a sign of desiring distinction, that I'm trying to put my little mark on things. I'm going to add my little piece. Is that truly because Srila Prabhupada is pleased by that? Or is that just the change disease, Srila Prabhupada would sometimes call it, where the instinct to make my mark means that I've introduced something extra, something different. Yeah, as far as dressing in different ways, I mean, it's kind of an interesting balance. On the one hand, we want everyone to participate, and we say there's no hard and fast rules. Let everybody be engaged. But Srila Prabhupada set a standard for us, and I'm sure Srila Prabhupada would have something to say about the beards. I'm sure he'd have something to say about the amount of hair that's coming in. I'm sure he'd have something to say about, so many things that no longer reflect the strict mood which he established. And Srila Prabhupada was very compassionate. I was making this comment the other day in a discussion on this very topic, that in the early days in Haight-Ashbury or the Bowery, Srila Prabhupada didn't introduce any restrictions. He just allowed and encouraged everybody to participate. And that spirit should still be there. We should wish everyone to participate. But if someone was taking the lead, particularly once Srila Prabhupada had established ashram standards and so on, I'm sure that he would be concerned. He would be deeply concerned about some of either the strange garb or some of the practices. Even this mantra here, Jai Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda, it was at one stage Bhaja Sri Krishna Chaitanya, and Srila Prabhupada at a certain point decided to outlaw the Bhaja and just make it Jai Sri Krishna Chaitanya. So we shouldn't confuse Srila Prabhupada's wishing to engage everybody with a completely laissez-faire approach. Otherwise, yes, we run the risk of becoming sahajiya, of taking everything very cheaply. And especially if we start to preach standards or philosophies, we then forget that we acquired whatever standing we have and whatever understanding we have from Srila Prabhupada. So we actually don't have authority other than representing faithfully. And as soon as we introduce our own ideas, potentially we're cheating people. We're cheating people of what Prabhupada came to offer. If we see ourselves as humble representatives, then we will, without any self-serving desire, simply pass on what Srila Prabhupada gave to us. because then we can be 100% confident this is what was revealed to us. And that doesn't mean we can't employ our intelligence. In fact, Srila Prabhupada, I believe, tells of the veterinary's apprentice. So a veterinarian was taking around his apprentice. There was a horse with a swollen neck. He asked for a hammer or a mallet, hit the horse's neck. The swelling disappeared immediately. And the apprentice thought he'd got it. He thought, right, I've watched what my guru is doing. I'll now set myself up. I'll become a practitioner. Several dead horses later, the veterinarian caught up with him and said, what are you doing? I'm doing exactly what I saw you do. I'm hitting the horses' swollen necks. That horse had swallowed a watermelon. It's not the only cause of a swollen neck. So we have to make sure, and that's why it's described not even just to listen, but to actively inquire from the spiritual master. In fact, Srila Prabhupada says blind following is not recommended. Just being dogmatic and saying, almost beating people with Prabhupada says, we should pick up the right understanding from the spiritual master through inquiry. And that means our intelligence is being properly engaged. But we should always scrutinize this tendency to invent. It's typically restlessness. It's typically seeking distinction, seeking personal to stand out. So I mentioned in relation to sahajiyas because at least the bad habits that Srila Prabhupada focuses on in this purport is the tendency to concoct. Srila Prabhupada was extraordinarily liberal, but he also balanced that with being he showed by his own example. He said, my only credit is I've not added anything, taken anything away. I've presented what I acquired from my spiritual master. He would say sometimes he met Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur maybe 10 times. It wasn't that he had extended association. But one of the things that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur noticed in Srila Prabhupada is, I have marked him, he likes to hear. I think it was at Kumbh Mela, not sure what year, where Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur would speak for many hours in the tent. And most people got restless. They sat for maybe an hour. And we can see that in our classes. Classes are typically the most thinly attended part of the program. And even then, people drift off. They'd rather be anywhere else. They get fidgety. They get distracted. This is part of our condition in the age of Kali, that we lack the intellectual fortitude to keep ourselves focused. But this is actually the only thing that actually keeps us from completely wandering off the path. If we haven't listened carefully, we won't even be able to distinguish the path from the deviant path. Or if we find at some point, often too late, that we've wandered off the path, at least if our intelligence is fortified, we'll find our way back to the path. Whereas if we've been used to inventing, casually picked up all kinds of misconceptions, we're deep off the path, way into the undergrowth, and we wouldn't even know where to turn. And this would be such a tragedy, because Srila Prabhupada has gone out of his way to help us form the strongest distinctions. And that's why, to me, we have to remember that we're here by mercy, we're here by grace. We don't have some big qualification to invent our own ideas. We should be extremely careful. That's not to say that we shouldn't present in our own words. That's not to say that we shouldn't consider, according to time, place, and circumstances, how to position things. But if we haven't spent our time doing basic math, then we're taking a big risk trying algebra. So our ability to present Krishna consciousness according to time, place, and circumstance means that we've been deeply grounded in that listening and wishing to please the spiritual master, and we've rooted out all of these other tendencies, because our intelligence is able to spot them. Otherwise, we just live by impulse. Whatever feels good, we do it. You could say that's one of the expressions of Sahajya. If it feels good, do it. They don't see any benefit of the rules. In fact, they like to flaunt the rules. They see that as a sign of being super advanced, which is such a shame, because it will spoil everything. I think there was one servant of Srila Prabhupada, well known to the Australian Yatra, who was, maybe he had 2 or 3 weeks growth since he'd last shaved. And Srila Prabhupada said, so this hippie thing is coming back, is it? Super heavy. So that vigilance is something that needs to be there. We don't realize how precarious our situation is, how unqualified we are. And so better to just take shelter under Srila Prabhupada's lotus feet and not brashly wander too far away, wander out. Like you sometimes see a child will try to prove that they're brave and courageous by wandering away from their parents. Most children have at least the instinct to stay within the line of sight, but they like to try and push it, see how far they can go. Much better to just stay safe. We have no idea. When the acharyas tell us that we're asleep on the lap of a witch, we should take that seriously. Pisachis are not people to be casual and lack vigilance around. They can destroy us, take our lives at any moment. And that's the nature of our precarious situation here. So those are just some thoughts prompted by Ajita Prabhu's question, hopefully. Again, there's time if others would like to add anything. Krishna Kirtan Prabhu, you probably have some additional insights on this one, or Alalanath Prabhu.
There's some quick about beards. The other day I was walking with Kudra Maharaj, and he was talking about beards. And he said once he grew a beard and went in the shade of Prabhupada, he said, what do you think, Prabhupada? And Prabhupada rubbed his own face, smooth shade of his face, and said, I like this better.
Srila Prabhupada was sometimes super gentle and sometimes ferocious like a lion, and absolutely no inconsistency between the two, depending on what he saw as the mentality that does someone need a gentle nudge or do they need an absolute thunderbolt? And the sadhus give us thunderbolts to help us avoid a real slap from Maya. Like a sadhu's words may be cutting at times and may hurt. It's nothing like the pain of repeated birth and death, the kind of punishment that Maya will dish out. So that heaviness on the part of the spiritual master is actually an expression of love. It's the full weight of love. They want to spare us from suffering, but sometimes they come out heavy. In this case, he probably thought Maharaj just needed a little nudge.
He went straight away and shared it off.
I think Mukunda Maharaj has been always particularly attentive. Like he never needed the loudspeaker. He was able to take the subtle cues. I was talking the other night to a group here that had joined in for Kirtan about Mukunda Maharaj and talking about the Charlie Chaplin story when they're in Montreal, and I think it was Mukunda Maharaj asked the question, Srila Prabhupada, we don't have your erudition, we don't have your stature. How will we be successful in Europe? How can we possibly be successful? And he told of a film that he'd seen. I'm not sure if it was Charlie Chaplin, it might have been another from those old movies, the black and white movie. You've seen the movie?
We're desperately trying to find it, by the way.
Yeah, I've been looking for it as well. So the hero, the protagonist of the story, sits on a bench and some naughty youths come along and nail his coattails. He's on his way to a ball, a dance, and they nail his coattails to the bench. So when he stands up, his coattails rip all the way up the back. And he's oblivious to this. He just goes into the ballroom and he's dancing with wild abandon. And he notices that everyone's looking because they're looking at the state of dress here. So he gets even more excited. They must think I'm a great dancer. So he gets even more excited and gets into his dance. And before long, everyone's thinking, we don't know what this guy is on, but they all tear their coattails and they all dance with wild abandon. And Prabhupada gave no purport. He just told that story. That was his answer to how will you be successful. And Mukunda Maharaj took the purport enthusiasm. You don't necessarily even have to fully grasp, but if you have that conviction, if you have that enthusiasm, then it'll be infectious. And what an extraordinary insight that I'm sure fueled their great success in London and throughout the world. Having the confidence to go and meet the Beatles, make the record, take Krishna consciousness global. The other favorite anecdote that I have heard from Mukunda Maharaj is when he, after Srila Prabhupada had a stroke in 1967, he was going back to India. The devotees were all worried. What if Prabhupada never returns? And so they were all discussing that we should ask Prabhupada what to do. And Mukunda Maharaj was the one who drew the short straw. Srila Prabhupada, if you leave, what should we do? Is there someone else that we should turn to? One of your godbrothers maybe we should turn to for guidance? And Srila Prabhupada again, after deliberating for a moment or two, with tears in his eyes, he said, my spiritual master was no ordinary spiritual master. He saved me. And again, that's quite cryptic. But Mukunda Maharaj instantly knew that was an offensive question. Only he could lead them is the name of that particular book. And that story really brings it home. So we're Mahajano Yena Gatasa Panta, we are extraordinarily fortunate in New Govardhana to have Mukunda Maharaj here. And this is the safest way to pick up Krishna consciousness. Those who spent time with Prabhupada, who picked up Srila Prabhupada's mood, who saw how he addressed it. If we want to know how to stay within the tram lines, then Mahajano Yena Gatasa Panta, then we follow the ways of the great authorities and suppress this invention instinct. Anyway, now I've gone over time. Srila Prabhupada ki